Good evening, everybody. So there are people, church-going people who follow this book, who will confidently affirm that when they die, they are going to go to heaven. It's an article of their faith. Just to take a couple of the major ones, the Catholic Catechism teaches that each man receives his eternal retribution in his immortal soul at the very moment of his death, in a particular judgment that refers his life to Christ, either entrance into the blessedness of heaven or immediate and everlasting damnation. The Church of England have the Westminster Confession, and they say, "The bodies of men after death return to dust and see corruption, that their souls, which neither die nor sleep, having an immortal subsistence, immediately return to God who gave them. The souls of the righteous, being then made perfect of holiness, are received into the highest heavens." It is an article of their faith. They believe that they will go to heaven when they die, if they haven't spent their life going to church now. They believe that there is an immortal soul which will continue after the death of their body, and that it will ascend to heaven upon the death of that body. But what does the Bible actually say? What does the Bible tell us about our immortal souls? About whether we have one at all, what our soul is, and whether there is any hope for anything after this life. Let's start right at the beginning, Genesis and chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7 tells us that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So at the very beginning, the formation of man, we are told that this clay form which God had made, having breathed into his nostrils, became a living soul. There's no separation between the two things. There's no soul that was imparted into a body. There is the body that becomes the living soul when God breathes life into it. So this idea that on the death of the body the soul will continue doesn't stack up with the description of the way in which God created man in the first place. Doesn't make sense. There's no separation there. There's nothing that will continue after the death of the body. It's interesting, while we're in Genesis, just to skip back to chapter 1, verse 21, we are told that God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. Every creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly. So sea life is described as a creature or a living creature. And it is the same word in the Hebrew, in the original language that the Old Testament was written in, that is translated soul at the end of Genesis 2 and verse 7. Man became a living soul. Now neither the Catholic Catechism nor the Westminster Confession would say that whales and living creatures of the sea had an immortal soul that would go to heaven. And yet the Bible describes them in the same way, uses the same word for them, the word that it uses for the living soul, by which it describes man. Have a look at verse 24, where God says, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so." The living creature there, the same phrase as in verse 21, is the same word in the Hebrew as is the word that is translated soul in Genesis 2 verse 7. And here it's describing cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth. So the man who becomes a living soul, in this respect, is no different from these animals who are also living souls, who have been created by God to have life and are therefore living souls. And there are other examples in Genesis 1 that we could look at in Genesis 2, but we're not going to. The point has been made for us. There is no separation between our body and our soul, based on how God describes the way he created man in the beginning. The first man, Adam, was created, and he became a living soul. We are living souls. There is no body and soul separation. Just come forward with me to the prophecy of Ezekiel. Let's have a look at chapter 18. Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord came to me again, saying, What mean ye that ye use this proverb concerning the land of Israel, saying, The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." And it was a complaint by the children of Israel. They were complaining about the fact that as they saw it, the fathers were sinning, but it was the children who were being punished for it. The sins of the fathers were being visited. The punishment was being brought upon the children. God says in verse 3, "Ye shall not have occasion any more to use this proverb in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. As the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son is mine. The soul that sinneth, it shall die." Now that's a direct contradiction, isn't it, to what we read from certainly the Westminster Confession, which said very clearly, souls, people have souls which neither die nor sleep. But God says very plainly here that the soul that sins, it shall die. Now we know, because we've read Genesis chapter 2, that there is an equation there between the soul and the person. When it's talking about the soul, it's just talking about the person. And God is saying that the person that sins, he will die. That people don't escape the punishment for their sins. That ultimately all will die having sinned first. But that's not what we read. And so the Bible directly contradicts this idea of an immortal soul. If we just come back to Psalm 6 for a final point in this connection. We read the beginning of Psalm 6, the psalm of a man who is deeply in trouble, who is crying out to God to save him. He says in verse 2, "Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am weak. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are vexed. My soul is also sore vexed. But thou, O Lord, how long? Return, O Lord, deliver my soul. Save me for thy mercy's sake." He is praying for help from God. because he wants to remain alive. Because he knows, in verse 5, in death there is no remembrance of thee. In the grave who shall give thee thanks? At the point of his death, there will be no more worship of God. There will be no more praise of God. There will be no more remembrance of God. Because at the point at which he dies, there will be no consciousness. There is no immortal soul which will carry on, which will waft up to heaven to be with God. In death, there is no remembrance of God, says this psalmist, and so he is pleading that God might save his life, that he might have further occasion to worship God. We could look at further passages, but I think these have shown very clearly there is no immortal soul. There is no heaven going when we die. There is nothing that continues of us after our death. So what then is there? Is this life it? And then we die, and that's the end. If there's no going to heaven, what can we look forward to? We're going to spend some time now looking at that to see the picture that the Bible gives of what is going to come in the future and what the hope is for people who read the Bible and understand what it says. And we're going to start in Isaiah and chapter 51, if you'll come there, please. Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 10 asks the question of God and says, Art thou not it which hath dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, that hath made the depths of the sea a way for the ransomed to pass over? And it's a reference, a remembrance back to what happened with the children of Israel at the time of the Exodus, when God dried up the sea so that the children of Israel could come out of Egypt and go into the land which he had promised them. But it is not only a reference to that. Because verse 11 says, Therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return, and come with singing unto Zion. So there was going to become a time in the future for Isaiah which would mirror that time which had already happened back in Exodus, when God would bring his people and they would come into his land. And we are told how they will feel in verse 11. We are told that everlasting joy shall be upon their head. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and mourning shall flee away. So what the Bible is talking of is a time in the future when there will be a host of people whom God will have brought into the land of Israel, who will have everlasting joy. And to have everlasting joy, they must therefore be a people who will be everlasting. You can't have everlasting joy unless you are there forever to be joyful. And so the Bible is promising a future for people which will be an everlasting future. It's not the immortal soul which will go on and on and on. But it is a time when people will live forever. And they will be on the earth. Verse 11 talks about them coming with singing to Zion. So So the Bible tells us very clearly that there will come a time when there will be people who will live forever, who will be on the earth. There is no need for them to go to heaven to receive a reward. They will be on the earth and they will be living forever. Come forward a little bit to the prophecy of Daniel, and right at the end, Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 follows on from a prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, which is speaking towards the end of that chapter of things which will happen in our future. So it is a prophecy of time which is yet to come, which hasn't happened yet. And Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 says that at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Now that picture there of people sleeping in the dust of the earth is a picture of people who have died, who have been buried, and who are waiting for a future time. They are dead, but the Bible describes them as sleeping because God has the power to raise them from the dead, to wake them up, to give them life again. And it tells us that some shall awake to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. So again, we have a prophecy of a time which is yet to come, when people will be raised from the dead, and some of them will be given everlasting life and the opportunity to live forever. If we just turn back a few pages to Daniel in chapter 4, we can see another picture of this time. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 1 introduces us to Nebuchadnezzar, the king, and he is writing a letter, giving a speech to all people, nations and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good, he says in verse 2, to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. And the rest of the chapter goes on to show how Nebuchadnezzar was brought to recognize the power of God in contrast with his own power, and brought to understand the future as it was for him and for the world. But this is how he describes it in verse 3. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. So we've seen that Daniel chapter 12 talks about a people who will live forever, who will be given everlasting life. Daniel chapter 4 says that God is preparing a kingdom which will be an everlasting kingdom. And it will be populated by these people who Daniel 12 says will live forever. Now this so far has been pretty Old Testament based. Let's come forward to the New Testament. Let's have a look at the words of Christ. John and chapter 6, please. We've seen how God has promised everlasting life to a certain group of people, and how he's promised them a kingdom that they will live in, and how Isaiah 51 says that there will be everlasting joy for those people. John chapter 6 and verse 40, Jesus says, "This is the will of him that sent me, that everyone which seeth the Son and believeth on him may have everlasting life." And so there is the same promise which we have seen in the Old Testament. Jesus extends it out to those who believe on him and says, "I will raise him up at the last day." So we read in Daniel 12 of them being raised from the dead. Christ says it's going to be him who is given the power from God to do that, to raise up these people. And we see the same thing in verse 47. The same criteria for these people. Verse 47 of John chapter 6, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believeth on me hath everlasting life." So Jesus holds out that same promise, that there is a group of people who have been offered the hope of everlasting life. And it is a group of people who, verse 40 and verse 47 of John 6 say, believe on Christ. It's a group of people who have been offered a kingdom. Daniel chapter 4 said, a kingdom which must be on earth, because Isaiah 51 talked about those who had everlasting joy going up to Zion or up to Jerusalem. So what will it be like then? This kingdom that God has promised. Well, come back to the Old Testament, come to Psalm 37. We've seen already that it's only a particular group of people who are offered everlasting life. Those who believe on Christ. Psalm 37 and verse 9 tells us, for evildoers shall be cut off, but those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. For yet a little while, and the wicked shall not be. Yea, thou shalt diligently consider his place, and it shall not be. But the meek shall inherit the earth, and delight themselves in the abundance of peace. Now we can look around the world today and see that that hasn't happened. There are still evildoers. It doesn't take us long, if we're watching or listening to the news, to hear of people that we would describe like this. But God promises that evildoers shall be cut off. And that there is an inheritance of the earth for those that the Bible describes as meek. So John chapter 6 says Jesus would give everlasting life to those who believed on him. Psalm 37 says they would have to be meek. The idea of being prepared to wait for God to act. But God promises that he will act, that evildoers shall be cut off, and that the meek will inherit an earth which is at peace. In connection with that, come forward to the prophecy of Isaiah again. Have a look at Isaiah in chapter 2. The Bible is full of pictures of this time, of a time when Jesus will have raised the dead and the kingdom which they will inhabit at that time. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 2 says, it shall come to pass in the last days. Remember, Jesus had said that I will raise him up at the last day. It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come ye, Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Psalm 37 talks about an earth at peace. Isaiah 2 gives us that same picture of an earth where there will be peace. There won't be any weapons for war because there won't be any need for them. And so the Bible does hold out a promise, doesn't it? It holds out a promise not of going to heaven when we die, but a promise of a time when Jesus will raise the dead, when those who have waited for his return, many who will have died before his return, some who won't, will be granted everlasting life based on their response to Jesus in this life. Everyone which seeth the Son and believeth on him. This is what is promised by God. An opportunity to live on the earth forever. But the question is, how do we be part of this promise? Come back to the book of Genesis and chapter 17. Because God made a promise to a man called Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 6, we read one of the sort of set of promises that God made to this man. And he says in verse 6, I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generations, for an everlasting covenant. So here's the same idea. Abraham is being promised that he can have an everlasting life and be part of an everlasting covenant. God says in verse 7, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. And I will be their God. And so God promises Abraham a certain portion of land to be his forever. Which again requires that Abraham would live forever, would have been given everlasting life. Now we know that Abraham is dead. But God has promised that he will be raised from the dead and that he will be given a new life. God says in verse 9 to Abraham, thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. This was the token of the covenant. To be part of this covenant, this is what had to happen. To enter into the family of God, to become an inheritor of the promises, you had to be circumcised. And verse 14 goes on to talk about what would happen if you weren't. But that's not the case anymore. Because circumcision, God has given a replacement for circumcision. Just come to the letter to the Colossians and chapter 2. Abraham was made this promise that he could have everlasting life if he kept the covenant of God. It was conditional. Abraham couldn't just have it. But as long as he kept to that covenant, then he would have part of that promise and live forever. And we are given the same offer. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 10 says, "Ye are complete in him which is the head of all principality and power, in whom also ye are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, in putting off the body of the sins of the flesh in the circumcision of Christ." What is that circumcision? Verse 12 says, "Buried with him in baptism, wherein also ye are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised him from the dead." Baptism, the full immersion in water of those who would dedicate their lives to God, is the way that we enter the family of God. And by belief in baptism and a continued walk of righteousness, a striving to do what God requires, we show ourselves ready for that time which God has promised, when he will send his Son back to the earth, when Christ will raise the dead, will offer some everlasting life. We can be part of that Son if we are prepared to believe Christ, to follow what he says, and to keep that covenant which God has made to us.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthAndProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.